Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview with me.
My pleasure.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's get started. So first off, I would like to know, who were the biggest inspirations for your career as an investigative journalist?
That is actually a good question, and honestly, no one has ever asked me that before. So I'd say, if you think about it, the first person I think who was a real inspiration was actually my oldest sister, Claudia, who died a few years ago. She was a journalist when I was still a student trying to figure out what I wanted to be. And I was actually training to be a teacher at that point. But she seemed to be having so much fun that I thought maybe that's something I want to do. And I changed gears completely, and I ended up in journalism school because of her, at least partly. But the other thing that I think influenced me was the Watergate era. And I think that journalists of my generation, quite a few of us might say that. I was kind of a dorky kid, and I was watching Watergate hearings on television, and I was paying attention to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were breaking all the stories for the Washington Post, and the movie came out, and the whole romance of being able to do that as a journalist really caught my imagination. So I'd say those two things were what really inspired me in the very beginning to be a journalist.
Wow, it sounds like you're very passionate.
I am. You know what? I am to this day. I've been in this business now. It's been such a long time. Since 1980, 81, I started in journalism school, and it's been such a long time. But if you asked anybody who knows me or works with me whether I'm still passionate about what I do, I absolutely am, and I feel really lucky that I can still feel that way about what I do and going into work and still wanting to do it after all these years.
Do you feel that it's important for someone to be passionate about the journalism profession to be successful?
Yeah. Oh, there's no doubt about it. You can't do this job properly and not be passionate about things like wanting to know the truth, caring about what's in the story, because you'll be hitting all kinds of roadblocks and challenges all the time, things that are going to upset you or frustrate you or discourage you from ever getting the story. So if you're not passionate, you're going to get turned back at the first obstacle, and you're not going to make it in this business. The only way you're really going to sustain yourself for weeks, if not years, is to be really passionate about, and I know this sounds corny, truth and justice.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I just wanted to know, have you changed as a person during this time? I know you said you've been doing this since the 1980s. So, yeah. I mean, obviously you've grown, but do you think that some of the events that you've witnessed and been through have changed you as a person?
That's another really good question. Definitely. And then the first thing I think about is all of the international reporting that I've done and the things that I've seen in the wider world that I would not have seen but for being an international journalist and witnessing conflict and witnessing people living in poverty and getting to know them at least a little bit as real people has changed my outlook on the world tremendously, and understanding international issues, that they're not international to me. I was there. I saw those things. So it's impossible for me to be living as an insular person or a person with limited views on things, because I have stood in these places and I have experienced these things. I mean, I don't think that the core of what I was as a person when I started this, as somebody who was interested in the world around me and sought stories and wanted to tell stories, has changed, but my wider appreciation of the world has absolutely changed me, and I hope for the better. I know some journalists who have experienced and seen the things that I have developed post-traumatic stress disorder. I fortunately am one of those who has not. That's not to say there are certain things in my psyche now that are more wary than they used to be, but I've managed to be able to retain a sense of compassion without letting it eat away at me. Colleagues I know who have had nightmares or shattering experiences. Hasn't happened to me yet, and yet I still feel like I'm a caring person.
Good for you. That's inspirational. So, throughout your career as a journalist, which investigations have been the most memorable for you?
Well, I think, there's different kinds. Really, when I was a really young journalist, and when I was 24 years old and really just starting out, I was part of an investigation that now looks somewhat small to me, but at the time was absolutely huge. And I found out that a BC cabinet minister owned stock in a forest company that he was part of making key decisions on. And he was actually the Minister of Forests. So he was in a huge conflict of interest. And I remember we reported that story at noon, and he had resigned by 3:00 in the afternoon.
My goodness.
And for me, as a young journalist, that was really reinforcing of the fact that if you want to make a difference, I made a difference with that. So after that, if I go through the years of different stories, I can't help but think about the time that I went into Zimbabwe undercover, which is a different kind of investigation, but certainly is investigative. And Zimbabwe wasn't letting any Western journalists into the country at the time because they were in so much tumult and trouble. This was back in the early to mid 2000s. And so I went in there with a cameraman, and we both posed as versions of what we really are. I said I was a lawyer, which I am, and non-practicing, and he said he was a music teacher, and he is in fact a musician. And we said we were there on a bird watching trip, and we went into the secondary airport there, and they let us in, and we stayed in a safe house, and we did our reporting over the course of a few days, and it was very tense, not least of which because the person who we had hired to help us inside the country hadn't arranged any of the things we wanted arranged. So we had to move quickly and carefully to get all of our work done. And the second last day we were there, we interviewed the leader of the opposition, went to his compound in Harare, and then just raced out of town and went to another safe house in another town, and flew out the next day. And we had stories that were hugely impactful, images of lineups for bread, lineups for the bank, lineups for gas. And our stories were broadcast on the BBC, not just on the CBC, because we got inside when other people didn't. That's a huge highlight for me.
That is. It sounds like a huge milestone. So were you some of the first journalists to get in and report?
In a long time.
Okay.
Yes, and the other thing about that, Megan, was that on that trip, one of the stories we got was we were taken into an area where these people were living in mud, and all of their homes had been knocked down, and they were living in absolute filth. And the reason why was because they had dared to vote for the opposition party in the last election. And we were able to get those faces and tell that story in a very powerful way to the world. And I'll never forget that. It was just, it was a way of trying to give a voice to the voiceless, which has always been really important to me.
Wow, that is moving, I have to say. So, in the present moment, is there anything that you're especially excited about or worried about?
Yeah, in equal measure.
Okay, yeah, well, there you go. Or do you feel like there's any maybe threats or, I don't know, something that should be receiving more attention right now?
Okay, so Megan, I thought you meant, was I equally excited and worried about a story?
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
So can you explain to me what you mean by that?
Okay, so do you feel like there's anything going on right now that is being underreported by the media that you think deserves more attention?
I am absolutely sure there are many things going on that are underreported, but what I think I focus on right now is actually something that I don't do anymore, but I did when I was a younger journalist, and that is covering local news. We've had so many cutbacks now in our traditional or legacy media that there aren't journalists who are going to council meetings in great measure anymore around the Lower Mainland, around the province, around the country, around the continent. There's little scrutiny of what is going on at a very local level of government, which is government that's closest to the people. And I lament that. I think that's very sad, and I hope that might change if someone dreams up a new model of journalism that sustains that kind of reporting. I don't see it coming. I know that there are journalists who are actively working on that sort of thing. But that really worries me, because if you think about the fact that journalists are one pillar of democracy, then to not have them involved in what is really the democratic institution that is closest to the most of us, it's quite a scary thing. And now, as I've just said that, which is a bit more obvious because everyone in our craft is talking about it these days, and that is the demonizing of journalists, led by the one and only Donald Trump, that is being picked up by other less than democratic leaders to say that the press are purveyors of lies, that there's false news, that the press are the enemies of the state is terrifying, and we've seen the result of it. We have seen journalists be imprisoned. We've seen journalists be murdered, and it's even happened more recently in the United States when those journalists in Maryland were murdered in their own newsrooms. So that, to me, is terrifying. And I listened to Trump talk to the publisher of the New York Times the other day on a podcast in which he was being challenged about that, and he sounded somewhat reasonable in the podcast about it. It sounded like he understood for the first time what he was saying, but I don't expect to see him back down on any of that. And that is irresponsible in the extreme.
That is devastating. And that's a really good point, Laura. So do you think that the role as an investigative journalist has changed over time?
Yes, because of technology.
Okay.
You okay?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And it's changed in technology, but you might think because of that it's made it easier, but not necessarily, because you have access to information in one way a lot more easily than you used to. It's at your fingertips. You can easily search social media to get information on someone and maybe get some other contacts, things that you could get quickly. Court record searches you can now do from your computer often. There's a lot more resources online to dig into investigations and all different kinds, and I'm not going to get into the details of them. But the downside of all of that is that sometimes trying to get information has become much more difficult because, and I'm thinking about government again, that they're hiding information much more than they used to. There are frustrating attempts to get at it. There are freedom of information laws in this country that are anything but freedom of information in reality. They obfuscate, they set up barriers, they give you documents that are so heavily redacted they may as well be meaningless. So that's very, very difficult. So it has changed. It's easier in some ways, much harder in other ways, but I still think that you still see investigative journalism flourishing. The other thing actually that's really changed now, which is so interesting, and I was a part of this, is journalistic enterprises working together on projects. I was involved on a project with the Toronto Star. The CBC and the Toronto Star worked together on a project about the Panama Papers. And you'd never do that before. You'd never work with a competitor. But we did it. It was awkward. You shared interviews. You shared information. You worked together to coordinate when you were going to present all of your information to the public. And it's not without its bumps, but it worked out, and that was a microcosm of what's going on at a larger level with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is a worldwide body where journalists are encouraged to share with one another and to coordinate across nations on different kinds of projects. And I've been doing some of that as well. I'm currently trying to work with an Austrian journalist about an investigation I'm involved in. So that's an unusual and a really interesting new development that I think is having a big impact.
Oh, that's very interesting, because I would have assumed that the internet would have brought a lot of fierce competition, especially with a lot of fake news sites. They seem to be proliferating endlessly. So that's interesting that you're collaborating.
Yeah. I mean, but if you're a good journalist, you know what is fake news and what isn't, and you know how to run down your sources and run down your information, so you're not going to get tricked.
That's true for a journalist, but for the public?
For the public, it's a different thing entirely.
Exactly.
I through the day that the people got hold of the internet and started publishing the fake news, all I can do is try to insist that people become more media literate. And I don't know how to do that. I wish that there were mandatory courses for people who are on the internet and understanding that kind of thing. It is a scary thing, and it's a good point you're making.
Yes, it is scary. What would you say are some common myths about the journalism profession?
Well, that we propagate lies or untruths. I guess I'm trying to think, Megan. That we are lazy, that we are sensationalist, that we don't bother to tell all sides of the story, that we're not balanced. Yeah, I guess that sort of thing. I mean, the old hoary stereotypes are of the cigar-chomping, whiskey-drinking journalist, and I mean, that used to be true, but it's not anymore. If you want to be a successful journalist, you're going to have a really hard time of it if you're unhealthy and you drink a lot, because you just can't keep up.
Yes. Now, speaking of successful journalists, what has been your personal key to success? Or some of them?
Well, I'll just go back to what I just said, which is I think I'm not downplaying this. I think being healthy is a really important part of it. You can't keep up with the pace of what you need to do. If you're, I know this sounds ridiculous, if you're not in good health, because it's such a demanding profession. Being willing to work a lot of hours, work weekends, cancel plans, give yourself over to the stories that you're working on, just willing to make the next call, talk to the next person, run down all the leads that you need to, not be afraid of questioning authority. And I think, but the other key to my success has been that I actually went right when I was starting out, I took a pause in journalism and went to law school. And I did it with the intention of becoming a legal affairs specialist as a journalist, because there weren't a lot of jobs around that I thought would help. And I almost ended up practicing law, but I didn't. I ended up in journalism. And I'm telling you that the education I got, and I went all the way through to being called to the bar, the education that I got has proved to be, to me, endlessly valuable, because the skills I've often said between law and journalism are somewhat similar in terms of needing to understand vast amounts of information, understanding all sides of the story, being able to tell the story, asking questions and being fearless about asking the questions. I learned a lot of that in law school, and it just made me more confident as I struck out on my path as a journalist.
Wow, I did not know you were a lawyer as well. So, what awards and or successes have you received? I know that you recently received an award from Amnesty International Canada. Was that your second from them?
Yep.
Wow, good for you.
Good research. Yeah, that's the second time, and I'm actually very, I'm proud of this because of the story that was attached to it. Do you want me to tell you what that story is?
I would, yes.
So it was a story about a young Afghan woman who was shot in the face by her husband, and then actually survived, believe it or not, and fled with her mother and her sister to India. And she had several surgeries there, and UNHCR declared her as a convention refugee. The United States agreed to take her and her sister and mother in as refugees, and then several months later, when Trump came to power, they sent her a letter withdrawing their offer of shelter in the United States, saying that she was a security risk because of her husband, of all things. So Canada quietly, very quietly, stepped in and approved her residency in Canada in a very short order, and she arrived in Vancouver just over a year ago. And I found out about it with the help of a colleague of mine and managed to get in touch with her and told her story, which had not been told before. And along with her telling of the story, it made a huge impact. And I have such respect for this young woman. Her name is Shakila Zareen. And in fact, I'm in the midst of preparing a longer documentary about her first year in Canada that I'm actually, it's going to be something. It's a big project. It's a staggering project. It's like nothing I've ever done before, but I know it's going to be a really good piece when it finally gets to air. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
I'm just curious, when do you think that will be done by?
We're looking at airing it in March.
In March. Oh, so very soon.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
I'm just in the midst of getting it ready for going into an edit. So.
Oh, yes, I definitely read about this. I remember seeing the photos on CBC a while ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, yes, it sounds very egotistical. Yes, I've had a number of other awards over the years, but the other biggest one to me was the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University, which allowed me to spend a year more or less being a student at Harvard, being paid to be a student at Harvard, which is just astounding to me. And soaking in the environment, soaking in the knowledge, and coming out of it a much better journalist than I started out as. It was extraordinary.
Oh my gosh. I didn't even know there was such a thing.
Well, when you get around to it, you can do it.
Did you enjoy Boston?
Yeah.
That's where, okay.
Oh, gosh, who wouldn't? I mean, it's not, the fellowship isn't all about work. It's also, you're doing the fellowship with a dozen other American journalists and then 12 or 13 journalists from other parts of the world. So there's a huge social aspect to it as well, which is really important. And that actually was the first step toward leading me to do international reporting, was meeting all of these other people from around the world, these other journalists, and understanding how much harder it was for them in many cases to do the work they were doing, including one of my classmates was from Zimbabwe, and he has since died, which was very sad. And he had been imprisoned by the regime in Zimbabwe because he wanted to publish a free press, and he was badly beaten in prison, and he carried the emotional scars of that for a long time afterward.
Wow. Sorry, that was very sad.
Yeah.
So you also lived in Washington, D.C. as well, and London. So you've been all over the place, all over the map.
Yeah, and traveled to many other places beyond that.
Yes, but you're from Vancouver, that's correct?
I'm from North Vancouver.
North Vancouver.
Born and bred.
Oh, wonderful. Love it there. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, I can't think of anything. I mean, you got some questions people haven't asked me before, because I've done interviews before. I mean, I would just want to reinforce the importance to anyone of a free press in a democracy, and to hope that whatever throes and difficulties our craft is going through right now, that we'll be able to come out the other side of it stronger, and that young journalists like you are the key to the future of all of this. I know you face a lot of uncertainty, but the other flip side of that is you face a lot of opportunity. And I really am impressed by young journalists who I see coming up through the craft right now. And I just hope all of you get a chance to experience what I've been so fortunate to experience over the course of my career.
Thank you so much for your time, Laura.
You're welcome.
Okay, have a great night.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.